Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate very much the comments of my colleague from Minnesota, who's been a strong champion for America's workers, who believes that we should make this nation and our economy work for working Americans. And certainly his leadership on this overtime rule is much appreciated. Today should be a day of celebration, a day in which 4 million American workers who work overtime without getting paid, but who earn very modest salaries, we're going to get rewarded for their overtime work, get paid for their overtime work. But instead, those 4 million Americans are getting Scrooged. Now, you all remember the story of Ebenezer Scrooge. He made a lot of money, very successful businessman, enjoyed counting his coins while treating his workers in a terrible fashion, paying them as little as he could get away with. Well, that's exactly what's at stake with this overtime rule. The vision of the overtime rule was that when you had a very well-paid manager who clearly was earning far more than they would if they were earning a more modest amount plus overtime, that it was just simply possible to reduce the complexity of tracking their hours and tracking overtime, and instead they could simply be paid a salary without compensation for overtime. But the key to that was it was a very well-paid worker, very well-paid manager, not someone earning just near the bottom of the scale, barely more than minimum wage. So today should be a day of celebration with the overtime rule being modified to fit inflation for the many, many decades that have passed since it was put forward, and to be adjusted for inflation from here forward. But it's not a day of celebration. It's a day in which approximately 4 million Americans are getting Scrooged, and that means also 40,000 Oregonians who were looking forward to finally getting compensated for the overtime they were working during this coming holiday season, were also being told, no go, no paycheck, no compensation for your overtime. These are folks earning as little as $23,000 a year. A lot of retail workers going into the holidays being asked to work far more than 40 hours a week, 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week, and not a dime of overtime. And that's wrong. Now, a whole lot of these workers are parents raising children. It's pretty hard to raise a child on $23,000 a year. I don't think anyone in this chamber, any one of the senators here in this chamber, has raised a child on $23,000 a year. If they had attempted to do so, they'd have an understanding of why they should be up here right now joining this fight for the overtime rule, hopelessly outdated, hopelessly unfair to America's workers, to be implemented in a timely fashion, to be implemented by legislation that we could pass today. But instead, senators with their far larger salaries are very happy going about preparations for their holiday without considering that today is a day in which 4 million American workers are getting treated unfairly. Since 1975, the share of full-time salary workers who qualify for overtime has plummeted from 62% to 7%. Well, that's pretty dramatic reduction. So over a year now, millions of American workers have been looking forward to today, when finally their long hours of overtime were going to be compensated, which is only fair that they have that compensation. But just like Ebenezer Scrooge, the Republican Party, in coordination with 21 states, have said to those 4 million American workers, bah humbug. You don't get compensated for your overtime. We're putting a lump of coal in your stocking, and too bad that you're trying to raise kids. This happened because states filed a lawsuit and got a preliminary injunction granted by a judge to take away the power of today's overtime rule, the modified overtime rule, to assist American workers. Now, I grew up in a blue-collar family. My dad was a mechanic. My mother was a stay-at-home mom. And my father, on a basic blue-collar salary or wage, was able to put food on the table, buy a 3-bedroom ranch house with a garage, acquire a car, have modest family camping trip vacations. Pretty square deal to provide a foundation for his children to thrive, to have opportunity. Working with his hands. And our whole community, our blue-collar community, was in much the same case. But when he worked overtime, when he was asked to stay on the job because a machine needed to be repaired and finished to get done in time for a client of the company to be able to put that machine to work, this heavy equipment to work, building highways or working in the forests or working building dams, when he worked that overtime, he got paid for that overtime. And that was right and fair that he did. It's not right and fair that America's workers today are not getting paid for their overtime, working longer, working harder to see that extra wealth go to the CEO of the company. American workers are working longer hours, but their wages and their paychecks are getting spread thinner and thinner. And the overtime rule is a long overdue adjustment for those who are working those long hours. You don't get any help from this rule if you're not working more than 40 hours a week. It is President Franklin Roosevelt who said, when he was talking about the importance of living wages to support families, he said, quote, "By living wages, I mean more than bare subsistence level. I mean the wages of decent living." Isn't that what we're talking about, the wages of decent living? Is there anyone here who would contend that a parent raising a child at $23,000 a year has the wages of decent living? I don't think so, not at the cost it is at to exist in today's society, not when rent on a 2-bedroom apartment is $800 to $900 in Portland, not when the cost of groceries is at where it's at, not where the cost of health care is at where it's at. Franklin Roosevelt meant the wages of decent living that no individual who works full-time should live in poverty. He meant that working Americans should be able to earn enough to raise and support a family and provide a foundation for their children to thrive. He meant that you should be able to earn enough to save up over time and retire with dignity. He meant that a working American should be able to earn enough to cover the basic necessities of life, food and clothes and shelter. But for many Americans, those goals are out of reach, even though they're working a lot of overtime on which they are not getting paid. We just haven't kept pace with the vision of families being able to earn, as Roosevelt put it, the wages of decent living, the wages that enable you to live decently. This rule is critical to changing that. This rule is critical to fixing that. So while the courts tie up the process at the request of my Republican colleagues and state governments, we should instead have a bill here on the floor and simply pass this adjustment ourselves. Did anyone notice we just had a presidential campaign in which both candidates talked about making America work for working Americans? So the candidate who came ahead in the Electoral College, lost the popular vote, by the way, came ahead in the Electoral College, has claimed that he's going to watch out for working Americans. Well, where is he today, on the day 4 million Americans are getting Scrooged? Where is Donald Trump today, on the day that those who work overtime are now told they will not get paid for that overtime? How about a tweet in the middle of the night saying, "I get it"? If we return to the story of Ebenezer Scrooge, we remember the fact that he was resisting any effort to enable his employee, Bob Cratchit, to have Christmas Day off with his family or to be able to have a decent amount of food on the table on that day. His heart was a few sizes too small. And the night before Christmas, he had a dream. And in that dream, ghosts of the Christmas past and Christmas present and Christmas future came to him and showed the poverty, the spiritual poverty of his life, showed him the emptiness of his life, that life is not about building up treasure so you can count it coin by coin, but to enable other families to thrive, to help them to succeed, to share in their joy, build joy in the world. And he woke up, and he was a changed man. He woke up and said, yes, my team, my workers, shouldn't be working on Christmas Day. Yes, I should pay them more. Yes, I should make sure that they have bountiful food to be able to care for their family. Yes, their son, Tiny Tim, should have the health care he needs so that he can live a full and productive life. And he took care of these things and personally went out and acquired the largest turkey he could for the Cratchit family. Well, isn't today the day that my colleagues who have been playing the role of Ebenezer Scrooge and fighting fair compensation for overtime, isn't today the day that they should take a nap, that they should go to sleep tonight and have a little bit of a dream about the circumstances of working Americans? Here we are just coming off a campaign where everyone talked about the plight of working Americans. Maybe a little of that should reverberate in your dreams tonight, that you might think about how families are struggling across America, how hard it is to put food on the table, not just in the holiday season, but throughout the year, about how unfair it is for someone to be working 80 hours a week and not getting paid overtime because they're only being paid $23,000 a year. Do I hear a single colleague volunteer to work at 80 hours a week for a year and get paid $23,000? I would love to hear that speech on this floor. When someone said, I get it, I'm all for this overtime rule of the past because I'm willing to live on $23,000. Well, I don't think I've heard that from a single colleague. Colleagues here are paid many, many times that increment. Maybe it's a little hard when you're living in a bubble to understand the plight of American workers, how hard it is to raise a family on $23,000 a year, given the expenses that you experience in today's society. So, tonight, let's have a few of our colleagues who have been such advocates of the Ebenezer Scrooge strategy of denying overtime to workers who are paid very little go to sleep and maybe get visited by the ghosts of the past and the present and the future. Maybe be able to put themselves in the same pair of shoes that working Americans work in. Envision themselves in the same set of circumstances and financial challenges that American workers have. And wake up tomorrow with a different vision. A vision of being a partner with working America. Make this nation work for working America. Make our economy work for working America. And come to this floor and insist that we immediately pass a bill to take care of these workers so they're compensated for their overtime. That would be a Christmas story to celebrate. And maybe while we're at it, our president-elect can tweet tonight in the middle of the night that he had a dream and he was visited by the ghosts of the past and the present and the future, and he saw a vision of treating workers fairly, and he wants the Senate to act tomorrow morning. Wouldn't that be a fabulous Christmas story? One that is completely consistent with the rhetoric we heard in this campaign about an economy that works for working Americans. I hope tomorrow morning That's exactly what we hear. Thank you, Mr. President.